Welcome to Bonsucro Production Standard Training, Module 6, Principle 4, Actively Manage Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, Criteria 4.1 and 4.2. This is the sixth module of 7 modules, 1 for introduction and 7 for the Bonsucro Production Standard. Now we will see the structure of the training material. Here in this slide we will have the information from the Bonsucro Production Standard. So outside the criterion, of course, here the indicator and the indicator description, here the scope, yes, mill agriculture or if it's the whole supply area, here the core indicator, or if we don't have that, is because this is not a core indicator, so to identify it. Now we have the standard and the metric indicator here. And of course, in this place, you can see the description of the full indicator requirements, exactly as it is on the Bonsucro Production Standard. Here, on this slide, we'll have a summary of the implementation guidance. So, the scope as defined in the guidance, the objective as defined in the guidance, and here, a guidance description summary for this implementation guidance. Some slides or some indicators need context concepts. So context concepts to better understand some points or some concepts like maybe living ways, social dialogue, risk assessment. So we have some slides in this place. Some of the indicators not need that context concepts. Others will need. And at the end, we have the indicator auditing guidance. This is a summary of the auditing guidance. So we will have first the Bonsucro Production Standard. Second, the implementation guidance to understand how to implement some concepts in the middle. And third, the auditor guidance, how to audit this indicator. This is the end of the structure for each indicator on the training material. From this moment, the camera will be closed. Please enjoy the training. Thank you so much. Welcome to Principle 4, Actively Manage Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This principle is made by 5 criteria. The first criterion 4.1, to protect and rehabilitate biodiversity and ecosystem services, as well as maintaining and enhancing HCVs. The second criterion 4.2, soil management plan in place to avoid erosion and maintain and improve soil health. This is what we will see in this module. 4.3, water stewardship plan in place. 4.4, pest disease and weed management plans in place and implemented. And 4.5, to ensure hazardous chemicals and materials do not negatively impact biodiversity and ecosystem services. 4.3 to 4.5, we will see it in next module. So the intent of criterion 4.1 is for cane production within Bonsucro certified supply chains to maintain and enhance biodiversity, natural ecosystem, and high conservation values. The 6 indicators under implementation are closely linked together and are to some degree complementary. So, mapping biodiversity and natural ecosystem across the supply base, as regard the 4.1.1, provides a starting point. The advantage of mapping biodiversity and natural ecosystem across the wider supply base area include, of course, providing a perspective of landscape level biodiversity features, such as riparian areas or habitat corridors, that benefit from coordinated approach to mitigate impacts from cane production and to maintain or enhance these features. And of course, screening which biodiversity and HCVs features are likely most relevant within individual farms to guide operators in developing the biodiversity. Management plans for ongoing cane cultivation, so in 4.1.2, within the unit of certification, that we had to implement some plans now in the certification area, and 4.1.3 and 4.1.4 avoid unacceptable expansion since 2008 and 2021 through the land use change analysis. So how to have that past vision to be sure that sugarcane in the supply chains are correctly grown actually. 4.1.5 and 4.1.6 prevent on new planting. So this is now an indicator, two indicators that prevent for these mitigating impacts and preventing any further of natural ecosystem of HCVs due to that further expansion of agriculture and of course a deforestation. So this is the cycle. We are working in this criterion, mapping unacceptable impacts of expansion of the actual sugarcane ground and of course mitigating impacts for the new plantings. Now, the first indicator, 4.1.1, the operator shall ensure that the key biodiversity and ecosystem services are mapped. This is for agriculture and for the whole supply area. So it needs to map biodiversity and natural ecosystem across the supply base. And the mapping shall be updated for company policies or best practices. So the mill operator should have maps. So that maps, how to construct the maps. The basics are maybe satellite imagery, can be actual satellite imagery, and after to make a cover interpretation of cover, maybe with a methodology like coring land cover can be, and also it can be with a aerial photography. So there are two options, but the idea is to map the covers in all the supply chain. Of course, to locate the mill, the sugarcane plantations, and the supplying growers in that supply area. Of course, the natural land cover in and around the sugarcane fields. Indicators is possible of presence of species. Key biodiversity areas as recognized as national or international, like Ramsar sites. UNESCO World Heritage sites and biosphere reserves, intact forest landscapes, and any other environmental and biodiversity risks and impacts. Of course, also to identify riparian zones, to identify the sugarcane, and of course all the important points around the plantation. From the auditing point of view, it's important to be sure who made the maps, how the maps have been done, what's the date of these maps that maybe need to be updated, what we can find on the maps, and to be sure that the scope is for all the supply area. So of course the auditor need to access to the maps and to have this map to control other indicators in the same criterion. So of course to see the qualification of the person who made the maps, the definition of biodiversity ecosystems that have been mapping actually. The map covers at least all the area included in the unit of certification, the frequency of update as same, and of course the operation impacts. The mill need to be there, and the auditor need to check that. That not can be so useful, not only for criterion 4.1.1, but also to see criterion 4.3.1 on water stewardship information. The second one, or 6, is 4.1.2. The operator develops and implements a biodiversity management plan. So that plan needs to have threats and impacts the cane production have on biodiversity ecosystem services. Of course, a mitigation and restoration measures that must be taken, and of course a plan, as all the plans in Bonsucro Production Standard, with objective monitoring activities, agreed responsibilities, timeframes, and allocated resources. That plan needs to have also a continuous improvement and need to be revised at least every 3 years. So a biodiversity management plan that need to be included, constructed in the basics of the map, of course now for the unit of certification of mill agriculture, and to implement and to be sure that that plan have that objective indicators and and measurement information. So in the implementation, it's important to understand who will make that map, to be clear that the competencies of that plan, the competencies of the people or assessors that will construct that plan, to identify the risk, to identify, of course, the natural ecosystem biodiversity, or HCVs, have been identified at least in the map in the 4.1.1. Now, what are the threats of these values? The mitigation or restoration measure for this area, the goals and objectives, the plan of specific activities, some indicators to measure and to show that the plan is going to improve some indicators, specific allocation of resources, and person, of course, who is responsible of this plan. This plan needs to be documented and implemented. Some activities may include, for example, the use of agrochemicals in some areas, the banned agrochemicals, the critical ecosystems, the habitat connectivity, and all the information for the implementation of a biodiversity plan to protect and enhance maybe HCVs identified, or ecosystem identified, or riparian zones identified. From the auditing point of view, the auditor needs to be sure that the plan exists. That is an updated plan that for no more than 36 months. To be sure that who made the plan, who was in the construction of this plan, to cross-check the resources and to cross-check with the map, the aspect identified in the maps, to identify if that plan includes some risk and negative impacts, to identify what are the results of the management plan, to identify who is responsible for this plan, and to identify what are the recourse of the implementation of the plan. This is very important. So how the company monitoring the progress, how the company have a continuous improvement of this plan to be sure that the impacts and measurements are going in a good way. Now in 4.1.3, the indicator says that the operator ensures that no areas of natural ecosystem defined internationally or nationally as legally protected has been converted to agriculture on or after 1st of January 2008. So it's important to conduct a land use change analysis, ALUCA, of the unit of certification to determine and to be sure and cross this information with actual information, maybe with the map in 4.1.1, to be sure that no sugarcane have been converted or damaged natural ecosystem identified as international or national as legally protected. So the second indicator that need to include in this land use change analysis is 4.1.4. So the operator ensures that no other areas of natural ecosystem have been converted to agriculture on or after 1st of January 2021. We link that to indicators in the same implementation and auditing guidance. So this is a core indicator, and the operator conducts, of course, land use change analysis of the certification to determine what's the land use change between 1st of January 2021 and the actual date. So minimum levels of conversion are permissible, of course. If that's minimum, it can be converted, and of course, prior to any greenfield expansions or new agricultural projects, the operator conducts a Bonsucro risk assessment for expansion that we will need to see in next indicators. So please note that a remediation and compensation procedure or equivalent document may be produced in the future, which will be applied to this indicator, taking into account maybe new members. So the cut-off dates are different and the analysis are different, but can be identified in the same map. So the 4.1.3 is for, of course, that national or international ecosystem identified as legal protected ecosystems. For example, on IUCN protected areas, or the national protected areas, and other important areas for conservation as listed in the indicator. So the first cut-off date is 2008 from now. The second one is 2021 to now. And in addition of the above information, now we will see all natural ecosystems that have been also identified in the 4.1.1. So we have now the information from the past on what cannot be in the Bonsucro supply chains as change of any natural ecosystem to Bonsucro production after 1st January 2021, and of course the international that we cannot be including the supply chains from 1st January 2008. The methodology again is the land use change analysis, that is the transposition of intertemporal satellite imagery to analyze land use change. And in this example, the land use change analysis, the LUCA can identify whether there has been a land use change from internationally identified natural ecosystems to sugarcane between 2008 and 2021. So we have an interpretation of covers of 2007, for example. This is an identification of covers, let's say, for 2021. And this is maybe an identification of covers from now. So we can see the change of land use change for example, sugarcane and secondary forests. But it's important to identify here, of course, in the methodology, and to be sure who will identify that. If that were natural ecosystems, yes, that haven't been changed after 2021, or if that were international and national legally ecosystem or protected areas in this zone. This is an analysis that needs to be done for a competent team to do that kind of land use change analysis with satellite imagery, with, of course, interpretation of covers and a GIS team. Now, from the auditing point of view, we need to have the result of that land use change analysis, but also to trace back the information, to trace back the satellite imagery, to trace back the person who made that information, to cross with, of course, own information on international and national legal protected areas, and to cross also with maybe their own information on natural ecosystems that can be changed after 1st January 2021. So to see new planting in this area, to state the land on, of course, before the map need or the LUCA need to include the information before 1st January 2008, between 1st January 2008 and 1st January 2021, and of course between 1st January 2021 and today, that is the map for 4.1.1. Okay, so the record, the evidence, and the competency of the person who made that maps. When the company is in certification, they have the maps, they have the LUCA, and now we have the 4.1.5. The operator assures that cane expansion is from non-HCV areas following certification. This is a core indicator, so from date of the initial certification or from the date of publication of this standard, whichever is the later, the operator shall not expand into natural ecosystems or areas containing HCVs on the unit of certification. And of course, you need to conduct all possible actions to prevent that. So prior to any greenfield expansion or new sugarcane projects, you need to be conducted a Bonsucro HCV risk assessment for expansion for the planned areas and implement the HCV risk assessment procedures that we will see later. It's very important. So this indicator says, and it's a core indicator for all operators certified that are certified, they need to have that for all new planting, a Bonsucro HCV risk assessment for expansion. So it's important that the operator know very well what means the Bonsucro risk assessment for expansions, that he understands that he cannot develop areas on natural ecosystems or HCVs indicators, and of course to understand what it means, where are they, and how to conduct that risk assessment that will put on different scenarios that we will see. So of course, no expansion of agriculture or into natural ecosystems. Why for agriculture? Because the intention is not to have other crops before sugarcane, so in the transition between the natural ecosystem damage and the sugarcane. And of course, if the HCV risk assessment reveals high risk, and ALS, HCV Resource Network assessor, need to conduct the full HCV assessment. But now, what are HCVs and natural ecosystems? First of all, natural ecosystems exist in many shapes and forms, often seamlessly shifting and grading into each other, with borders changing over time. However, for practical purposes, it is often sufficient to distinguish three broad categories: forest, savannas and grasslands, and wetlands. So larger, little impacted landscape often consists of a mosaic of mixture of several ecosystem categories together with aquatic ecosystems like rivers and lakes. Now, HCVs there are different kind of high conservation values, and we can see one by one. So the first one, HCVs species diversity, are concentration of biological diversity, including endemic species and rare, threat, or endangered species that are significant and global, regional, or national levels. So this is HCV1. There are significant species and diversity identified. The second one are landscapes level ecosystem and mosaics, that are large landscape level ecosystems, and ecosystem mosaic that are significant and global, regional, or national levels, and that contain viable populations of the great majority of the naturally occurring species in natural patterns or distribution. So national, international, regional levels that are of great importance and that are protected too. HCV3 are ecosystem and habitats that are rare, threatened, or endangered ecosystem habitats or refugia. So this is more zone or areas, that have that importance for the ecosystem at regional level. HCV4 are ecosystem services, so basic ecosystem services in critical situations, including protection of water catchments and control of erosion of vulnerable soils and slopes. There, of course, they have a service for the ecosystems in this case. HCV5 are more in communities, so community needs, sites, and resources fundamental for satisfying the basic necessities, and this is more important, so important word, basic necessity for local communities or indigenous people. So for livelihoods, health, nutrition, water, etc. Identified through engagement with these communities or indigenous peoples, that need to be through that communication with them and participation on this process. HCVCs, we have cultural values, so that are more strictly social, sites, resource, habitats, and landscape of global or national cultural or archaeological or historical significance for culture. So a place important for the culture, local people that where they need to go, or maybe traditional cultures of local communities or indigenous peoples, identified through engagement also with these local communities or these indigenous people. So now, what's the link between HCVs and natural ecosystem? So high conservation values, particularly the environmental one, so HCVs 1 to 4, are often found in natural ecosystems, yet the two are interchangeable. As an example, wide roaming species of conservation concern, such as birds or prey, wildcats, and elephants, often move and forage in many different kinds of vegetation, including crop fields and plantations. So conservation of these may require measures beyond maintaining natural habitats. For example, strategies to resolve human-wildlife conflicts and/or patrolling and enforcement of hunting legislation, and other HCVs, particularly HCVs 5 and 6, are tightly linked to people. And while these HCVs may be linked to natural ecosystems, some community needs and cultural values are not located within natural ecosystems. So these HCVs 5 and 6 can be outside, as you can see, the natural ecosystems. Equally, some natural ecosystems, in particular remaining natural ecosystem in landscape that have experienced wide-scale development over an extended period of time, may not contain any HCVs. So we can have also some natural ecosystems that cannot contain HCVs. So we have HCVs that are the high conservation values, HCVs linked with the natural ecosystems, and of course HCVs that maybe cannot be linked with the natural ecosystems. And finally, what the Bonsucro risk assessment for expansion, how is this designed? So this section is designed to help operators decide if a proposed expansion of cane cultivation is compatible with the explicit and implicit requirements of the Bonsucro Production Standard version 5.1. So it's assumed the risk to natural ecosystem values in general and HCVs in particular are higher when lands are cleared or converted for example expansion of cultivation. So if we have a plantation since let's say 1950, there is no risk of expansion or affect that natural ecosystem. It's different when we have new plantations. So established operation. It also assumes that larger expansion projects are likely to generate more severe negative impacts than smaller scale new plantings. So of course, the more the new planting is, the more impacts can have. And that consequently, large scale expansion requires extra safeguards. So expansion in the vicinity of protected areas or other priority conservation areas is also considered to be associated with higher levels of risk. So we have the indicator 4.1.1 that define the maps and the areas, actual areas. We have the management plan of these areas. And after we have the 4.1.5 that the intent is to avoid the agricultural expansion into areas of natural ecosystem generally and to avoid the expansion leads to loss or degradation of HCVs. So prior to preparing the lands of expansion, the operator completes the Bonsucro risk assessment for expansion and implements the risk mitigation procedures by completing some risk questions. There are some questions that the company will need to answer that will lead to different cases, to different plans to implement. So you will be directly to a risk mitigation procedure that you should follow. So for risk mitigation procedures that require an independent expert to verify the risk and provide specific mitigation. So additional guidance is available for the expert to follow. So it's also recognized that level of risk may be affected by the more general national context. So many countries have legal requirements and provisions related to location of new cultivation, including comprehensive plans for land use and land zoning. Such instruments were effectively implemented, so may significantly reduce risks that cultivation of new areas lead to negative social impacts or to loss degradations. So actually we are here in the 4.1.5. We go maybe to a procedure that no need additional measures and need to procedure. So in this case, we go to indicator 4.1.6 to the environmental and social impact assessment. If the risk is medium, so the expert will evaluate the risk and provide mitigation measures to be integrated into the best management plan. So now we return to the best management plan to update that plan on the new planting. Or the third, the more risky, it needs a detailed HCV assessment to be integrated into best management plan. And of course, this HCV needs to be done maybe by the HCV resource network assessor, approved assessor in the ALS assessor. Now, this indicator also talks about preventing conversion of natural ecosystems and HCVs outside the units of certification for agricultural expansion. So 4.1.2 to 4.1.6 apply to the unit of certification. So with growing concerns on the ongoing loss and degradation of natural ecosystems due to agricultural expansion, corporate commitments and emerging legislation means that companies will increasingly exclude products that do not meet minimum requirements around no deforestations or no conversions. So indicators 1.2.3 and 1.2.4 requires that operators assess the risk across the supply base and accordingly develop and implement continuous improvement plans for issues identified outside the unit of certification. So the 1.2.4 makes special reference to preventing conversion of natural ecosystems due to agricultural expansion outside the unit of certification. Linked to that, this 4.1.5 states that all possible efforts should be taken to prevent further loss of HCVs in the whole supply area. In this case, what's important, we have the mapping. We know where our suppliers are actually. So if the company provides the seeds for new planting, they need to be sure where the seeds will go. They need to, of course, train the supply base and aware the supply base about no conversion maybe of protected areas or riparian zones, for example. Finally, from the auditing point of view, there is new planting, so no risk assessment for expansion. There is new planting, yes, so now what's your risk assessment for expansions? Please let me know as an auditor how you answered the questions of this risk assessment. What was the final conclusion of this? Who answered that? How he made that answer? There are written answers and clearly demonstrated answers. And what are the final results? An HCV with HCV resource network assessor, approved assessor. So we need now to be sure that they are going to the HCV resource network, that they find the assessor and they do the HCV before, of course, the new planting. A medium, so they need to be sure that the biodiversity management plan is updated with that information. Of course, they need also competent workers or assessors to be sure that this is correct, what the input of the biodiversity management plan have been done. So, no new planting, easy, no requirements, not applicable. New planting, please be sure that the risk assessment for expansion is done and well done. Now the last indicator of this criterion, 4.1.6, the operator conducts an environmental and social impact assessment when there is a significant change in operations or land expansions. This is a core indicator, and for all, of course, 100% of the new expansions or new operations. So, of course, when there are major changes of the workforce, also, for example, mechanization, or field expansion of more than 5% of total supply area, or 5% of rolling average, or 1,000 hectares, whichever is smaller, or of course, establishment of new sugar operations like mills, etc. So, changes are covered by the environmental and social impact assessment. So, that environmental and social impact assessment allows to identify the social and environmental impacts. So, first of all, identify and involve the potential affected stakeholders in this process, like through consultation, but also identify impacts of environmental impacts of this new operation or new planting. What are the impacts on water, impacts on the soil, impacts on the air, potential impacts. Of course, identify the way to mitigate that impacts, and keep the records of this process. Propose actions and set measurable objectives to mitigate that. So, of course, include, as said, stakeholder consultation, potential impacts, records of workshop, focus group, records of agreements. Then identify the mitigation strategy or plans, and at the end, it's important to be sure that retrospective environmental and social impact assessment should be carried out for extension projects that have taken place in the 12 months prior to initial certification. So when I'm starting the initial certification, I need to take that information reverse to the pass-through. Now, from the auditing guidance, it's important to be sure, is there an environmental social impact assessment for new operations or new planting? Yes. How it has been done, what records we have, what are the results, what are the plans, what are the records of these plans. There is no environmental social impact assessment to be sure that there has not been new planting or new operations on the last certification or in the last 12 months. So to be sure that there is nothing that seems to need an environmental social impact assessment. If not, it's okay. If yes, we need to be sure that it will be done. As a final auditor guidance note, it's important to take into account that the 6 indicators are cross-related and also related to indicators 1.2.3 and 1.2.4. As the protocol says, of course, if there are some no conformity or that is raised, it has to address the indicator that applies the best, which shows the indicator that applies the best on all of these indicators. And when related to areas outside the unit of certification, of course, the operator needs to present the appropriate evidence and action plans to prevent the situations. We pass now to criterion 4.2. Soil management plan in place to avoid erosion and maintain and improve soil health. So now the first of 5 indicators in this criterion are mapping of soils and or soil management units of the farm and the development of a soil management plan. So the operator shall have a map of field boundaries and their soil management units that can include, of course, the soil types and other characteristics relevant to manage the soil health. So that need to be done according to local industrially recognized best practices and, of course, ideally supported by scientific publications. So ideally, we need to have a soil study to identify the different characteristics of the soil, physical and chemical characteristics of the soil in some areas. And after with this information, we can construct some soil management units that will be more homogeneous in this case. So, of course, to identify the parent material, the soil system, the topographical sequence, the color, texture, available water, and aspects, to have the same management in some soil management units. So, of course, to identify the dominant soil types and or parent materials, and of course, local legal limitation for soils to agricultural production. Of course, each soil management unit that will improve for the management of these soils, will improve the identification of different management of the soils, will identify clay, soil depth, water parameters, soil constraints, and crop limiting conditions to, of course, have different, of course, soil management on the different soil management units. The auditor needs to understand what's the basics of the information for that soil management units, who does the study, if there is a basic of a soil studies before, who construct that differentiation, who construct the soil management units, what are the information taken into account, and how they construct that map. So, of course, the evidence of the map and all the information on how, when, who construct that map. Now, the second indicator on this criterion, 4.2.2, the operator develops and implements the soil management plans. So now this is a core indicator. And of course, the operator in this case implements the SMP that articulate the better management practices required for the operator to ensure, of course, in this case, the prevention of soil degradation, yes, and erosion of the farm soils to permit the optimal use of resources and the continuous improvement of the soils. So the plan needs to have the same aspects of the plans in the Bonsucro Production Standard: action, objective, agreed responsibilities, timeframes, and allocated resources, and of course need to identify and address threats and impacts of soil compaction, erosion and disturbance, lack of continuous ground cover, low organic matter, and alkalinization of acidification of soils. That practices and at preventing, mitigating, remediating, and reducing soil degradation for each management unit, identifying these management units from the 4.1.1, the 4.2.1, and of course the practice to continuously improve soil conditions are identified and implemented, of course, in this case. So after identifying the soil management, now from the point of view of the implementation, the important is to identify what are the risks of that management units, what are the practices, and what are the indicators we will keep to show that the management plan is improving the quality of the soil. So, of course, to be sure that of information of if there is soil acidity, if there is salinity, sodicity, if there is, of course, what correction will be done for acidity, for example, and retesting, of course, of subsoils, and in soil erosion, for example, to be sure, the minimum or conservation tillage, the organic matter information, the buffer strip, the drainage and water flow control. Of course, that soil management plan needs to be implemented and is part of the economical viability also in the future, to be sure that we keep the soils and we keep the organic matter and we safeguard that soils for the production of sugarcane. From the auditing point of view, first of all, that comes from the 4.2.1 for the mapping of the soils and the soil management units. After it takes from what this information leads to a management plan. So who is in charge of that management plan? What are the plans? What are the objectives? What are the indicators? How they measure to improve the soils and or to safeguard the soils and to keep them protected for erosion or to degradation. So what information they have, how they manage it, how they process it, and how do they plan to improve, keep these soils in the future. Of course, records and evidence of the implementation. In the 4.2.3, the operator conducts regular soil or leaf analysis. Regular soil or leaf analysis to inform the objective and monitoring included in the soil management plan, as well as for recommendation for fertilizer. So that analysis will show that the soil management plan have that indicator that are improving, and also is required for the recommendations. We need also a procedure, an analytical procedure for the determination of recommendations shall be done according to the local industry, recognized best practices, or ideally supported by scientific publication. How I take that samples, who take the samples, who train the person who take the samples. From the implementation point of view, it's important to agree with the agronomic team what are the times to take the analysis, leaf or soils, each 5 years maybe or each replanting for the soils, maybe in the medium for the leaf analysis, how to take that samples, who will take it, who will be trained on this sampling. So the top of 0 to 20 centimeters, the split sampling fields bigger than 10 hectares, every 5 years, sandier soils less than 20% clay. So to be sure that that procedure for that specific samples are clear, the people are trained, the information is going to a laboratory that can take the information we need, and that they are certified to take the information and to give us that answer and that information. Now, from the auditing point of view, are there samples? Yeah, leaf samples, soil samples. What are the criteria? Who take the samples? Why he take the samples? There is a procedure to be sure the workers are taking the samples in the procedure. Where are the information? How the information is used? Actually, where is the laboratory? The laboratory have the credential. We have the information coming from the laboratory. and of course the agronomic teams take that information to measure the indicator from the soil management plan, and also take this information to construct the fertilizers plans and recommendations. Now 4.2.4, the fourth indicator in this criterion, the operator applies as much fertilizer as recommended by soil analysis. So no more than 5% of the recommendations. This is a core indicator. And of course, the operator shall apply total of NPK, organic and inorganic, as recommended by the soil or relief analysis. So no more than the information that has been taken from the soil analysis. Of course, there is a proposal of productivity. And recommendations shall be done according to local industry, recognized best practices, and of course, ideally taken from scientific publications. It shall also have a plan in place to reduce fertilizer use over time. So first of all, who made the recommendations? To be sure, in this case, that we construct good recommendations that are linked with our objective of productivity. Yeah, and after this, we need to be sure that that quantity of product is the same. We need to be sure that we have, of course, also records of the application of agrochemicals, record of the person who applied it, what's the quantity of application, how they be sure that they can apply the quantity that we are recommended, and how we control that is done. So for sure, to calibrate the tools used for fertilizers, to be sure there is a procedure of calibration, to be sure that people supervising the application are sure that what they are applying is the same that is recommended, to trace all the information from the recommendation to the application. So amount of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus present in the soil, co-applied, derived from previous fertilizers, derived from harvest residues provided by other crops. And of course, there should be of an appropriate tip and measure of soil's acidity. From the auditing point of view, I need to have the fertilization plan to be sure that the person who made that plan is an agronomist that have the authority to make that recommendation. After the plan, we need to see how this plan need to be implemented. What are the quantities maybe per hectare or per lot? See records to be sure that that records cross back with the information. Maybe trace one plot, and to be sure that the information of application on this plot is the same than the recommendation. Of course, see and interview workers on application, how they calibrate the tools for the applications, and to be sure that that calibration and recommendation of application is the same than the recommendation and no more. Of course, also see records of total application and cross back with total recommendation to be sure that this information is clear. All the information will go in the calculator, and also go to trace the information in the calculator and trace back that this information is correct also. Final indicator on this criterion, the 4.2.5, the operator prevents sugarcane tops and leaves to be burned after harvest. Standard yes, that applies only for the field which have been burned prior to harvest, so not for green cane harvesting. And of course, the idea is for no burning of mulch, trash, blanket after harvest, except where this will be required for field cultivation or replanting, of course. So if the sugarcane is burned prior to the harvest, it is done so only with cool burners, or also referred to as cool burning, and tops shall be returned and evenly scattered in this case. So no burn of tops and leaves after the harvest. From the implementation point of view, it's important to train the harvesting team on this. It's important to clarify why it's not, and to aware that a team on why we cannot do that burning. to identify when there are burning and to be clear on the procedures and to document the procedure that cannot be done, and of course to monitor if it's done and to be clear that that cannot be done from now for this certification. From the auditing point of view, we need to have, of course, the harvesting procedure to be sure that burning of top of leaves after the harvesting are not included. Of course, to see field evidence, to go to the field and be sure after a burning, if possible, that there are not burning of top of leaves. Of course, interview with workers, interview with the workers team, records of activities after the harvest, evidence of coal burning activities, and of course adjustment to harvesting operations and for management in the trash material. All this information from the auditing point of view. We arrived to the end of this presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Please, if you have questions, please go to the Q&A sessions or contact standards@bonsucro.com. Thank you so much.